In the misty heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where narrow roads coil between damp hollows and the air carries the scent of coal and pine, lies the forgotten town of Birch Hollow, West Virginia. In November 2004, 19-year-old Lily Marlowe vanished after walking home from her shift at the diner on Route 6. At first it seemed like another story of a restless small-town girl disappearing into the night. But the truth that unfolded nearly 2 decades later revealed something far darker, something that had always been whispered about, yet never spoken aloud. Birch Hollow was a place bound by silence, where every porch light flickered with suspicion and every neighbor knew just enough to be afraid. Lily was the daughter of a widowed nurse, quiet but ambitious, saving every tip she earned to leave town for college. She had a bright laugh, a stubborn streak, and an unshakable belief that she would never become one of those people who grew old, watching the mountains fade through dusty kitchen windows. On the night of her disappearance, a cold rain had turned the narrow road slick. She closed the diner alone, stuffed her uniform into her backpack, and started the 20-minute walk home. Witnesses saw her under a flickering street lamp, umbrella trembling in the wind. A pickup truck slowed beside her. Some said it looked like the one owned by Travis Hampton, the son of the town's wealthiest family. Minutes later, both Lily and the truck were gone. By morning, her mother's calls went unanswered, and the next day, search parties combed the ravines. The police treated it as a runaway case, repeating that maybe she went north to start a new life. But people who knew Lily shook their heads. She had packed for a future, not an escape. Rumors crept through the bar, through the church pews, through the hollow hills themselves. Someone had heard shouting by the quarry that night, a girl's voice, then a splash muffled by rain. Others whispered that Travis had come home late, clothes soaked and boots caked with red clay from the quarry road. His father, a man who owned half the county's land, made a call to the sheriff before dawn. The official report mentioned nothing of those details. Within a week, the posters on telephone poles began to fade, and with them, the urgency to find her. The town carried on, pretending not to notice the hollow seat at the diner counter, the light that stayed burning on the Marlowe porch. Years later, those who remained would admit, quietly and often after too many drinks, that they all suspected what had happened. But in Birch Hollow, suspicion was dangerous. It could cost you your job, your home, your safety. The Hamptons funded the church renovations, the volunteer fire station, the sheriff's re-election. Theirs was the hand that fed the town, and no one dared bite it. So Lily's name became a memory told in lowered tones, a warning for young women not to walk alone after dark. Her mother aged quickly, clinging to the same house and the same unanswered prayers. By the time the case was reopened in 2022, almost no one remembered the exact date she vanished. What they did remember was the night the rain never stopped, the night the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the mountains themselves were listening. It would take 18 years for the truth to rise from beneath that wet soil, for a single voice to pierce the collective silence of an entire town. But on that cold November night in 2004, when Lily's umbrella lay broken by the roadside and her footprints dissolved into mud, no one could have imagined how long that silence would last, or how much it would cost to finally break it. Birch Hollow was never a place built for change. It sat tucked between ridges like a secret, a collection of weathered clapboard houses, rusted mailboxes leaning under their own weight, and a single main street that wound through the valley before disappearing into pine forest. The air there always carried the scent of wet stone and smoke from the coal trains that still rolled through twice a day, long after the mines had closed. People called it a good town, honest and quiet, But beneath that quiet lay a dense web of history, debts, and old grudges. Everyone was someone's cousin or someone's favor owed. Outsiders passing through might think the town was picturesque, a postcard of rural life. But for those who lived there, it was a place where time seemed to stop and watch you, where the same faces aged year after year without ever leaving. The Hamptons were the kind of family that defined a place like Birch Hollow. Their ancestors had built the mine, owned the land, and paid most of the wages that kept the town alive. Even when the mine closed in the late 90s, the Hampton name still carried weight, carved into the courthouse foundation and the marble plaque in the church vestibule. Old Man Hampton, as everyone called him, ran what remained of the family empire from a hilltop mansion that looked down over the town like a watchtower. His son Travis, the one Lily Marlowe had been seeing in the months before she disappeared, grew up knowing that the world would bend for him. He was handsome in that lazy, careless way that small-town royalty often are, good at football, bad at everything else, and certain that no rule applied to him. People forgave his fights, his drunk driving, his short temper, because his father's donations bought new uniforms for the team and fresh paint for the bleachers. When he began seeing Lily, it raised eyebrows. She was bright and driven, a waitress who read books between shifts and talked about leaving for college. For Travis, she was a novelty, a challenge, something pure that he could claim as his own. Those who worked with her at the diner remembered how she tried to hide the bruises on her wrist, how she laughed them off and said she'd fallen at the quarry, how sometimes she'd come in late, eyes red, but jaw set in defiance. Her mother knew something was wrong, but in Birch Hollow, mothers were expected to mind their place, and confronting a Hampton was like walking into a storm. The town's rhythm had a strange uniformity. Mornings began with the coal train, whistle echoing through the valley, followed by the hum of pickup trucks heading toward the lumber mill or the interstate. Evenings ended in the glow of the only bar, the Silver Spur, where men nursed cheap whiskey under the hum of fluorescent lights and women gathered gossip like currency. Every conversation eventually circled back to the Hamptons, to what they'd bought, to who they'd fired, to how their money could save or destroy anyone's future. For most residents, silence was survival. You learned not to ask questions, not to look too long at what you weren't supposed to see. That was how the town kept breathing. The sheriff's office sat next to the post office, a squat red brick building with a single deputy and an aging radio dispatcher. Sheriff Miles Turner had held his badge for 25 years, long enough to understand which cases were meant to be solved and which were meant to fade away. His re-election banners hung in the bar every fall, courtesy of donations from the Hampton Foundation. When Lily went missing, Turner had followed the familiar pattern: open a report, issue a statement, and quietly hope time would erase the problem. He told reporters that young people sometimes needed space, that there was no sign of foul play. Behind closed doors, he visited the Hampton house, emerging hours later with a handshake and a promise that the investigation would remain measured. It was the kind of arrangement the town understood instinctively. In Birch Hollow, power didn't have to be spoken. It was carried in nods, in who stood first at Sunday service, in who controlled the flow of money. Lily's disappearance brought a quiet unease to the town, but it wasn't enough to break the surface. The high school held a vigil that winter, candles flickering in the cold air, while the pastor spoke about faith and forgiveness, avoiding the word justice. Some residents came out of guilt, others for appearance, and by spring the posters had been taken down. The rumor mill had moved on. Travis left for a few months, supposedly working at his uncle's construction firm in Charleston, and when he returned, nothing was said. He resumed his place at the bar, laughing too loud, pretending not to hear, when the room went silent at his entrance. His father's influence kept the peace. The town's need for his family's money kept everyone compliant. The geography of Birch Hollow seemed to mirror its moral boundaries, narrow, winding, easily lost. The quarry loomed at its edge, a vast bowl of black water surrounded by skeletal trees. Kids used to swim there in the summer, though everyone knew it was dangerous. The water was deep and cold, swallowing sound. After Lily vanished, people stopped going, not out of fear, but superstition. They said the place had turned bad, that the wind there carried whispers when you stood too close. Still, no one called for it to be searched. The sheriff claimed the terrain was too unstable, the risk too high, and most were relieved not to test the lie. As years folded into each other, Birch Hollow stayed the same, its silence becoming its own defense. Outsiders occasionally came, journalists or cold case volunteers, but they never stayed long. They'd find closed doors, half answers, and a lingering sense that everyone knew more than they were willing to share. Over time, the edges of Lily's story blurred into folklore, told to teenagers as a cautionary tale about choosing the wrong kind of love. Her name faded from headlines. Her mother's calls to the sheriff went unanswered, and her case file gathered dust on the corner shelf of the records room. Life went on, as it always did there, muted, resigned, bound together by shared denial. What no one could see was how that denial was beginning to crack. Beneath the surface of polite smiles and Sunday hymns, memories festered. The people who had heard the shouting that night, who had seen the muddy truck, who had turned away out of fear, grew older, and guilt became a weight that refused to fade. Birch Hollow was not only a place, it was a pact, an unspoken agreement to keep certain truths buried. And like the mine shafts beneath it, some tunnels were never meant to hold forever. 18 years later, when the first fragment of bone rose from the mud at the quarry's edge, the town would learn that silence, no matter how thick, cannot keep the past from speaking. Lily Marlowe's life before the disappearance had been deceptively ordinary, shaped by the soft hum of small-town monotony and the quiet perseverance of a family that had already endured more than its share of loss. Her father, a coal miner like so many men in Birch Hollow, died in a shaft collapse when Lily was 9 years old, leaving behind a silence that her mother, Joan, tried to fill with the gentle rhythms of care work and faith. Their small house on Pine Ridge Road smelled of coffee and antiseptic, her mother's nurse's scrubs always hanging on the line, stiff from detergent and mountain air. Lily's room was painted a pale shade of blue, the color of the sky she always said she'd chase one day when she left the valley. She taped magazine clippings of New York skylines above her bed, marked college brochures with hopeful circles, and kept a shoebox under her bed, filled with photographs of places she wanted to see, sunlit campuses, city bridges, oceans she had never touched. Her ambition was something fragile, yet defiant, in a place where most dreams collapsed under the weight of necessity. Joan supported her daughter's plans as best she could, putting away a few dollars each week, whispering quiet prayers over every envelope sent to distant universities. Lily worked double shifts at the diner that clung to the edge of Route 6, serving truckers and locals who never looked her in the eye for long, their conversations drifting toward gossip about who was getting married, who was laid off, who had been seen leaving whose house after dark. She was polite but distant, her smile professional, her movements precise, like someone rehearsing for a larger stage. People admired her work ethic, but called her too proud, as if wanting more from life was an act of arrogance. When Travis Hampton began visiting the diner regularly that summer, no one was surprised that he set his eyes on her. He had the confidence of someone who had never been told no, a swagger that filled the narrow aisles between tables. At first, Lily ignored him. She had known boys like him her whole life, the kind who believed charm could rewrite reality. But Travis had a way of insinuating himself, showing up at closing time, offering rides, leaving small gifts like wildflowers or a new cassette for her Walkman. Against her better judgment, she began to soften. She told her mother it was nothing serious, that he made her laugh sometimes, that she didn't want people talking. Joan frowned but said nothing, though she later confided to a friend that she saw a shadow behind Travis's smile, something mean that surfaced when he drank. Through the humid summer and into early autumn, their relationship deepened and darkened at the same time. Travis was possessive, his affection edged with control. He disliked her plans to leave Birch Hollow, mocking her for dreaming of a world that didn't exist. When he drank, he accused her of thinking she was better than him. Their fights were public, loud enough that the town pretended not to hear. Once, in late September, a neighbor saw Lily sitting on the porch steps, her cheek bruised, her arms folded across her knees. When asked what happened, she smiled and said she'd slipped on the stairs. In a town like Birch Hollow, people were trained by generations of silence. They recognized danger, but turned away from it, because acknowledgement meant responsibility, and responsibility meant confrontation with power. Still, there were moments when Lily believed things could change. She had been accepted to a community college in Morgantown and planned to move after Christmas. She told her co-workers she wanted to study journalism, to write about the lives people tried to hide. The irony, of course, was bitter. That November, she started saving for a used car, working extra shifts, and babysitting for the church organist. Travis hated the idea of her leaving. He began showing up at her work more often, sitting in the parking lot for hours, pretending to wait for friends. He called her constantly, leaving messages that swung between apology and accusation. "You're all I've got," one message said, his voice slurred. "If you go, I'll have nothing." Lily didn't tell anyone about the calls, but she started keeping a small can of pepper spray in her purse and taking different routes home each night. Joan noticed the change, the way her daughter's laughter faded, the way her eyes darted toward the window when tires crunched gravel outside. She begged Lily to end things, but Lily only shook her head and said, "I will, after I'm gone." There was a strange calm in her resolve, the kind that comes when a person decides they've endured enough. On the evening of November 12th, Lily came home early from the diner, made tea, and sat with her mother in the kitchen. They talked about mundane things, bills, the weather, whether the old heater would last another winter. Before bed, Joan remembered her daughter lingering at the door, saying softly, "When I leave, don't worry about me anymore. Promise me that." Joan laughed, thinking it was youthful dramatics, but later that line would echo in her mind like a premonition. The next night was the one she vanished. Travis had come by the diner near closing, uninvited. They argued in the parking lot, his voice low but sharp, her expression tight with exhaustion. The cook, an older man named Hank Dorset, later told police that he saw Travis grab her arm and that she pulled away, muttering something he couldn't hear. She eventually got into his truck, maybe to calm him down, maybe out of fear, and they drove off toward the quarry road. That was the last confirmed sighting of Lily Marlowe alive. What came after were fragments, half-memories, distorted truths, and the town's collective decision to forget. Travis returned home late, his clothes damp, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. A neighbor saw him hosing down the truck before sunrise, water running pink down the gravel drive. When she mentioned it to her husband, he told her to let it go. "You don't cross a Hampton," he warned. By morning, the rumor was already spreading that Lily had run away, that she'd finally left for the city like she always talked about. The sheriff accepted that version easily, filing the report without a single interview with Travis. It was simpler that way. Cleaner. Safer for everyone involved. For Joan Marlowe, those first days were a blur of disbelief. She called hospitals, bus stations, friends of friends in other towns. She stapled posters on every light pole until her fingers bled from the cold. When she went to the sheriff's office demanding an investigation, Turner told her that unless there was evidence of a crime, his hands were tied. Behind his words, she could feel the weight of the Hampton name pressing down on her grief. The nights were the worst. She would sit on the porch long after dark, staring at the empty road, waiting for headlights that never came. Sometimes she swore she heard her daughter's footsteps on the gravel, but when she opened the door, there was only wind. The town pitied her in the way people pity tragedy they don't want to claim. They left casseroles on her doorstep, spoke softly at church, but avoided her gaze. Their kindness was the kind that kept distance, a way to ease their conscience without disturbing the fragile order of things. Birch Hollow moved on, pretending not to feel the fracture beneath its surface. Children grew up hearing the story as a ghost tale, not a crime, and the Hamptons continued their lives untouched. For them, the past was something to be rewritten through donations and gestures of charity. But for Joan, every day was the same, an unanswered question echoing through an indifferent valley. By the time the 10th anniversary arrived, she no longer attended the vigils organized by outsiders. She stood alone by the quarry once a year, tossing lilies into the dark water, whispering her daughter's name until her voice broke. The town would glance at her with sympathy, shake their heads, and return to their routines. Yet beneath their silence, guilt had taken root. Some carried it quietly, some drowned it in whiskey, but all knew that something precious had been taken and buried under layers of fear and influence. And somewhere, beneath the reflection of those still waters, the truth waited, patient as the mountains themselves. The night of November 12th, 2004, began like countless others in Birch Hollow, quiet except for the distant growl of trucks on the highway and the steady drip of rain falling from the eaves. The wind was restless, chasing leaves down the narrow streets, pressing against the windows of houses already dark by 9. Lily finished her shift at the diner an hour later than usual because the cook had called in sick, and she'd agreed to stay behind and clean the kitchen. The last customer left at 10:30, a local logger who tipped her 2 crumpled dollar bills and wished her a safe walk home. She changed into her old blue jacket, tucked her hair under the hood, and stepped out into the rain. The neon sign flickered behind her, its red light stuttering across the wet asphalt. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, leading past the church and out toward the bend that curved along the river. She held her umbrella low against the wind and started the familiar walk, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. What she didn't know, what no one could have known then, was that she was being watched. Travis Hampton had been drinking at the Silver Spur for most of the evening. He'd shown up after sunset, already unsteady, and ordered bourbon until the bartender refused to serve him. He left angry, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass, muttering that he just needed to set things right. Around 10:15, someone saw his truck parked near the diner, headlights off, engine idling in the rain. The security camera outside the gas station across the street caught a blurry image. Lily walking past, umbrella tilted, followed by a dark pickup pulling out of the lot moments later. The footage was grainy, indistinct, but when police later reviewed it, they dismissed it as coincidence. Birch Hollow had more trucks than people. It could have been anyone's. As Lily turned off Main Street toward Pine Ridge Road, the rain intensified. Her umbrella bent under the gusts, the ribs snapping one by one until she folded it closed and kept walking. Somewhere behind her, tires hissed on wet gravel. She glanced back, saw twin headlights sweeping through the mist, and stepped aside, assuming it was a late-night driver heading home. The truck slowed as it passed, paused briefly, then stopped a few yards ahead. She could hear the engine idling, low and uneven. When she tried to step around it, the driver's door opened. Travis's voice carried through the rain, hoarse and pleading. "Lily, wait. I just want to talk." She hesitated, exhaustion and fear warring inside her. She had told herself earlier, that week she was done, that she would end things cleanly. But confrontation had never been her strength. Against her better judgment, she approached. Neighbors along that stretch of road would later recall hearing raised voices, hers sharp and defensive, his slurred but desperate. One witness, an elderly woman who lived in the house nearest the curve, said she heard what sounded like a scream, short and choked off by the wind. But when she looked out her window, all she saw were headlights cutting through the rain, and then darkness again. Within an hour, the storm had swallowed all trace of her. The next morning, when Lily failed to come home, her mother called her phone repeatedly. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. By noon, panic had taken hold. Joan drove into town, stopping first at the diner, then the gas station, then the Silver Spur, showing everyone the same photo from her wallet. Most people shook their heads. The few who hesitated looked away, muttering excuses. At the sheriff's office, Turner listened impassively, jotting notes on a yellow pad without meeting her eyes. He promised to file a missing person report, but cautioned her that young people often need to clear their heads. When she pressed about Travis, his jaw tightened. "There's no evidence he did anything wrong," he said flatly. "Let's not jump to conclusions." That phrase would haunt her for years. By afternoon, search efforts had begun, led mostly by volunteers, friends from the church, a handful of deputies, and a group of miners from a nearby town. They combed the woods behind the diner, the riverbanks, and the old quarry road. Dogs were brought in, but struggled against the heavy rain that had washed away nearly every scent. The only item recovered was Lily's broken umbrella, half buried in mud near a drainage ditch 2 miles from her house. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of struggle. It was as if she had dissolved into the night. The sheriff's office released a short statement to the local paper 2 days later. "There is currently no evidence of foul play. The investigation remains open." The article ran next to a story about the high school football team's upcoming playoff game. Privately, many residents suspected the truth. Travis had been seen arguing with her before, had been overheard threatening to teach her a lesson if she embarrassed him again. But the Hamptons' influence stretched deep into the town's institutions. The quarry, the mill, even the sheriff's campaign fund, all bore their name. When a young deputy suggested interviewing Travis more aggressively, he was quietly reassigned to highway patrol. Witnesses retracted statements. The waitress who had seen the couple arguing in the diner parking lot suddenly claimed she must have been mistaken. Fear in Birch Hollow didn't come from violence. It came from the quiet power of what wasn't said. Joan refused to give up. She organized her own searches, hiring a retired private investigator from Parkersburg, who lasted barely 2 weeks before quitting, saying the town was like a wall. Rumors circulated that she was losing her mind, that grief had turned her hysterical. People began avoiding her at the grocery store, crossing the street to avoid conversation. She hung flyers until her hands blistered, called television stations that never returned her messages, and finally wrote to the governor. The only response she received was a form letter expressing sympathy. Winter settled hard over the mountains that year. Snow fell early, coating the hills in silence, freezing the ground where searchers had walked. Joan kept the porch light on every night, convinced her daughter would find her way home. She left the key under the mat, just in case. Months passed, then years. The sheriff's office eventually closed the active investigation, labeling the case unresolved, but dormant. Birch Hollow moved on, as it always did, burying tragedy under routine. Travis married a woman from the next county, started working at his father's lumber company, and was often seen at the same bar, buying rounds for men who once whispered about him, but now accepted his generosity. Time, money, and fear rewrote the town's memory. But traces of that night remained. Every heavy rain seemed to stir them up, the echo of tires on wet gravel, the ghost of a scream carried through the wind. Children growing up in Birch Hollow learned not to ask about Lily Marlowe, not because they didn't know who she was, but because the adults' silence taught them it was safer to forget. The quarry, now fenced off and half reclaimed by forest, became the heart of the town's unspoken mythology. Teenagers dared each other to sneak past the gate, to throw stones into its depths and listen for the delayed splash. Some swore they saw a light moving underwater on clear nights. Others claimed to hear the faint hum of a girl's voice. In 2010, a heavy storm caused a small landslide along the quarry road, exposing rusted metal fragments that locals dismissed as old machinery. No one reported it. No one wanted the attention that might follow. By then, Joan's health had begun to fail. She spoke less of justice and more of forgiveness, though no one could tell if she believed the word. In her final years, she kept a box of her daughter's things by her bedside, the last letter from the college, the diner's name tag, and a photo of Lily standing by the river, smiling against the wind. When she died in 2016, the pastor at her funeral said she had finally found peace. The townspeople nodded, relieved. But peace was not the word for what lingered in Birch Hollow. It was an uneasy stillness, the kind that exists when the truth has been buried too long and the ground above it starts to shift. The disappearance of Lily Marlowe became a story told in hushed tones, the kind of legend that a town invents to mask its own guilt. Yet even legends have roots in reality, and in the deep hollows of West Virginia, nothing stays buried forever. By the spring of 2005, the official search for Lily Marlowe had already faded into paperwork and silence. But for a few determined voices, the investigation was far from over. Her disappearance haunted the remaining deputies, who had been young and idealistic enough to believe justice could still matter in a place like Birch Hollow. One of them, Deputy Aaron McClellan, kept a private file hidden in his desk drawer long after his superior, Sheriff Turner, declared the case inactive. He was 28 at the time, fresh from the state academy, still believing in the clean lines of truth and consequence. He'd been the one to first review the security footage from the gas station, the one who drove out to the quarry in the days after the disappearance, climbing through the mud with a flashlight even after his superiors told him to stand down. What he saw there, deep tire ruts half filled with rainwater, a torn strip of cloth that might have been from a jacket, and the faint smell of oil on the wind, never left his mind. When he mentioned it to Turner, the sheriff sighed and told him to stop chasing ghosts. "That family's done more for this county than anyone," Turner said quietly. "Don't make trouble where you can't win." McClellan nodded, but the words carved into him a permanent disillusionment. For months, he worked quietly, rechecking statements, comparing the times on the surveillance tapes, revisiting witnesses who were already tired of being asked. One night in late May, he drove out to the Silver Spur and watched Travis Hampton drink with his friends. The man's laughter was too easy, his eyes too clear for someone supposedly carrying the weight of suspicion. McClellan noticed the way the bartender kept pouring without being asked, the way the conversations around him softened when he entered. Everyone in that room owed the Hamptons something: a job, a loan, a donation, and the loyalty that debt bought was stronger than any oath to the law. Later that night, McClellan followed Travis's truck up the Ridge Road and saw it turn into the Hampton property, the taillights fading behind wrought iron gates. The deputy sat in his car for a long time afterward, the engine off, the windows open to the sound of insects and distant thunder. He realized then what the town had already decided. There would be no justice for Lily Marlowe, not from within Birch Hollow's borders. When McClellan left the department in 2006, he took copies of the case notes with him, unable to let go. He moved to Huntington, took a job as a security consultant, married briefly, and tried to bury the memories. But every year, when the rain returned to the hollow, he found himself dreaming of the quarry, the black water, the mud, the faint reflection of headlights sinking into the dark. Guilt is a slow poison, and in small towns, it seeps into everything, even distance. Meanwhile, Birch Hollow itself continued to contract inward, as though the landscape were trying to erase its own shame. The mine shafts collapsed one by one, the mill cut its workforce, and young people left for good. The Hamptons sold off part of their land, but kept enough to maintain their influence. Travis's father grew ill and retreated into seclusion, leaving his son to run what remained of the family business. Travis wore respectability like a costume: donations to local charities, appearances at church, polite smiles for the reporters who occasionally revisited the cold case. Yet those who knew him well noticed the cracks: the nights when his temper flared without cause, the whispered rumors about fights with his wife, the long drives alone toward the quarry road. People said grief had changed him, though no one could explain what grief he was supposed to carry. In 2008, a freelance journalist named Kara Jennings came to town to write an article about missing persons in rural America. She'd found Lily's name buried in an old database and thought it might serve as a compelling human interest story. When she arrived, she was met with polite resistance, the kind of empty hospitality that looks like cooperation but reveals nothing. The sheriff refused to give an interview, citing privacy for the families involved. The townspeople smiled but deflected, offering vague recollections or excuses about how long ago it all happened. Only one person spoke freely: Joan Marlowe, frail but sharp-eyed, her grief honed into something fierce. Kara sat with her for hours, recording as she recounted every detail of that night, every door that had closed in her face, every whisper she had overheard about the Hamptons. "They all know," Joan said softly, staring at the cross on her living room wall. "They've known since the beginning." Kara's article was published under the headline, "The Girl Who Vanished into the Rain." It drew modest attention, enough to reopen old wounds, but not enough to compel the state to act. Within weeks, the story was buried beneath fresher tragedies. What the article did, however, was reignite something in McClellan. He read it online one sleepless night and recognized the same frustration that had driven him years earlier. The next morning, he contacted Kara and offered her his notes. They met in a diner off the interstate, both cautious, both aware of what they were risking. She listened as he outlined the discrepancies in the sheriff's timeline, the missing evidence logs, the erased surveillance tapes that should have been preserved. It was enough to convince her to keep digging. For the next 6 months, she filed public records requests, tracked down former deputies, and followed a paper trail of property transfers connected to the Hamptons. What she uncovered was a pattern of quiet cover-ups: traffic violations dismissed, fines erased, allegations of assault dropped before ever reaching court. It painted a portrait of a family whose power wasn't loud, but absolute. In 2009, Kara submitted her findings to the State Bureau, attaching McClellan's old notes and an impassioned letter demanding that the Marlowe case be reviewed. The file was received, logged, and filed away. Bureaucracy has a way of suffocating urgency. When she called for updates, she was told it was under consideration. Months passed. Then, one evening in February 2010, McClellan's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except his laptop and a single box of documents labeled Marlowe. The police report he filed went nowhere. The responding officer seemed more concerned about whether McClellan had insurance than who might have wanted his records. Kara, shaken by the incident, left West Virginia soon after, telling friends that the story had gone cold again, in every sense. By the time the case hit its 10th anniversary, the state listed it officially as inactive. The quarry remained off limits, the water level rising with each passing season, concealing whatever truth lay beneath. Travis Hampton's public persona grew calmer, his charm more polished, though those who caught him alone said his hands still trembled when rain struck metal roofs. The town's collective amnesia became almost ritualistic. Each November, the church held a brief memorial for those lost too soon, without mentioning Lily's name. Joan attended every year until her death, her presence a quiet accusation the town endured rather than honored. In small communities like Birch Hollow, truth doesn't vanish. It corrodes slowly under the pressure of shared denial. Everyone sees the rust, but pretends it's just part of the landscape. By 2015, even McClellan had stopped believing the case would ever break. He packed away the last of his notes, stored them in a storage unit outside Charleston, and told himself he was done. Yet, like the echo of thunder over the ridge, the memory refused to die. When heavy rain flooded the quarry road that spring and washed away part of the embankment, exposing a strip of torn fabric and something metallic glinting in the mud, a local boy found it while fishing and brought it to his father. The man quietly threw it away, muttering that some things were better left buried. That single act of silence, small and cowardly, echoed the entire town's conscience. For almost 2 decades, Birch Hollow lived in that uneasy balance between fear and guilt, waiting for time to erase what it never could. But time, as it turned out, was about to betray them. The ground that had held their secret was beginning to shift. By the time Lily Marlowe's name surfaced again in 2018, Birch Hollow had grown smaller and meaner, the kind of town that seemed to resent even its own memories. The younger generation had moved away, leaving behind hollow storefronts, an empty school, and the steady decay of neglect. The Hamptons still owned half the valley, though their influence had turned brittle. Travis's father had died quietly in his sleep 2 years earlier, and his funeral had drawn half the town, not out of affection, but obligation. Travis himself had inherited the estate and the remnants of the lumber business, though most of the workers had long since gone elsewhere. He was a man prematurely aged, his confidence stripped down to routine, his eyes sunken, and his hair streaked with gray. He drank alone now, preferring his home bar to the public one, and avoided the quarry road entirely. When asked about Lily, he maintained the same line he had repeated for years. He hadn't seen her after that night, and he wished people would stop bringing it up. To most, it was an answer as familiar as the rain. Didn't satisfy, but it allowed life to go on. For the rest of the state, Birch Hollow barely existed, another fading town in the Appalachians. But for one person, it had never been forgotten. Jake Turner, a former classmate of Lily's, and now a private investigator working out of Charleston, had stumbled across her case while researching missing persons in rural counties. He'd left Birch Hollow at 18, vowing never to return. But when he read through the fragments of her file online, the police report, the clipped articles, The photo of a girl smiling in a uniform that looked far too big for her. Something in him tightened. He remembered her clearly. The quiet girl who sat 2 rows behind him in English class, who always carried a notebook, and who once said she wanted to write about the truth. That word stayed with him. Truth. In Birch Hollow, it had always been the most dangerous word of all. When Jake reached out to the county records office, he found the file incomplete. Several pages were missing, including the evidence logs and the transcripts of the initial interviews. Requests for the original materials were denied due to loss during relocation. He'd seen that kind of bureaucratic vanishing act before. It usually meant someone had made sure those pages disappeared. So he drove back to Birch Hollow for the first time in nearly 2 decades, his car winding through the same narrow roads where nothing seemed to have changed. The same crooked street signs, the same peeling paint, even the same old "Welcome to Birch Hollow" sign still leaning on its post. When he checked into the small roadside motel, the clerk looked at him warily, as if recognizing something he couldn't quite name. Jake began his investigation quietly. He visited the old diner, now shuttered and half collapsed, weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement. He walked the road Lily would have taken that night, the one that curved past the church and followed the river toward the ridge. The forest had reclaimed most of it, branches heavy with moss, the ground soft with decades of leaves. Standing there in the fading light, he could almost feel the weight of what had happened, an invisible imprint pressed into the earth. Later, he visited the sheriff's office, now run by a younger man named Doug Harlan, who had grown up in Birch Hollow and had inherited the job, much like one inherits an old wound. Harlan was polite but dismissive, insisting that the case was an old tragedy better left alone. Still, Jake noticed the unease in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact when Lily's name came up. At night, Jake reviewed what little he had gathered: newspaper scans, interview notes, the copy of the gas station footage that someone had uploaded years earlier. It was poor quality, but something caught his attention. In the reflection of the glass door, just behind Lily as she walked past, there was a faint shape, a pickup with a missing rear light cover. When he cross-checked registration records, he found that in 2004, only 2 trucks in the county matched that detail. One belonged to a farmer who had sold it the following year. The other was registered to Travis Hampton. The next morning, Jake drove to the Hampton estate. The once grand house loomed over the valley like a relic of better times, its paint faded, its shutters hanging loose. Travis answered the door himself, unshaven, his eyes wary but curious. Jake introduced himself as a writer, researching local history, avoiding the word investigation. Over bourbon in the dimly lit living room, Travis rambled about the town's decline, his father's legacy, the burden of responsibility. When Jake mentioned Lily's name, there was the faintest pause, a flicker of something like fear, then the quick deflection of habit. "That was a long time ago," Travis said, staring into his glass. "You're digging up ghosts," Jake smiled, replying that sometimes ghosts were the only ones who told the truth. That conversation might have ended there, if not for what happened the following week. A spring storm hit the region, heavy rain flooding the old quarry road and washing part of the embankment into the pit. Local teens discovered bones tangled in roots at the water's edge, small, delicate, unmistakably human. By dawn, police had sealed off the area, and the town that had spent nearly 20 years in silence found itself at the center of attention again. The coroner confirmed within days what everyone already knew, but didn't dare say. The remains were female, the approximate age matched, and the DNA was a match for Joan Marlowe, who had submitted a sample before her death, just in case. Birch Hollow's longest-held secret was finally surfacing, and it carried with it the weight of every lie the town had told to keep it buried. When Jake returned to the quarry to watch the excavation, the smell of wet soil and diesel hung in the air. Reporters gathered at the gates, their cameras aimed at a place that had been nothing more than a rumor for years. The sheriff stood stiffly at the scene, his expression unreadable. Travis Hampton didn't appear, but his name filled every conversation. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Birch Hollow couldn't pretend it didn't know. The mountains that had once kept its secrets now seemed to echo them back. And beneath the gray sky, it was as if the town itself was preparing to confess. When the news confirmed that the remains found at the quarry belonged to Lily Marlowe, Birch Hollow seemed to stop breathing. The announcement came on a damp morning in April 2022, when the mist clung low over the valley, and even the church bells sounded hollow. For 18 years, the town had convinced itself that silence was safety, that some truths were better left submerged in the dark. But now that the truth had a body, silence no longer protected them. It exposed them. Old men at the diner, who once joked that Lily had probably run off with a trucker, sat speechless with their coffee cups trembling in their hands. Women who had whispered condolences to Joan Marlowe at church years ago found themselves replaying every word they hadn't said, every question they'd avoided. Birch Hollow was small enough that everyone knew exactly who was being whispered about. They had always known. And that was the worst part. The state police arrived within a day, their presence abrupt and alien in a place accustomed to its own law. Trucks and forensic vans filled the narrow road leading to the quarry. They set up tents, floodlights, and evidence markers that glowed through the fog like fireflies. Watching from the ridge, the townspeople spoke in low tones, their faces pale and uneasy, as if the dead girl's return were a judgment upon them all. Sheriff Harlan tried to project authority, but it was clear even to outsiders that he was out of his depth. He issued brief statements to the press, carefully worded, procedural, stripped of emotion. But behind closed doors, his staff was panicking. The discovery of Lily's body reopened every failure the department had buried, every shortcut, every favor extended to the Hamptons. There were rumors of missing evidence, unsigned reports, and notes that had been destroyed. It was more than an old crime. It was an indictment of an entire system. Jake Turner watched it unfold from a distance, moving carefully between journalists and police lines. He had expected relief at the confirmation, but what he felt instead was something closer to grief. He knew the truth was supposed to set things right, but in Birch Hollow, truth was just another weight pressing down on people who had already forgotten how to stand tall. That night, unable to sleep, he drove through the rain to the quarry. The road was slick, the forest alive with the sound of frogs and rushing water. At the taped-off perimeter, floodlights still burned, illuminating the crater of black mud where the remains had been pulled from the earth. He stood there for a long time, rain dripping from his coat, and thought about Lily walking that same road all those years ago, tired and cold, but still believing in escape. He wondered how long she had been conscious that night, whether she'd seen the stars before the dark closed in. It wasn't the kind of thought that belonged in an official report, but it was the only kind that mattered. In the days that followed, state investigators began questioning residents, reopening old files, and seeking DNA samples to match partial evidence recovered from the scene. When they visited the Hampton estate, Travis initially refused to cooperate. His lawyer, a polished man from Charleston, cited harassment and warned of defamation suits. Yet the tide had turned against him. The locals who once protected the Hamptons no longer saw advantage in silence. Workers from his sawmill began to talk, recalling the night he came home soaked and furious, the dents on his truck, the scratches on his hands. A retired deputy admitted that he had been ordered to hold off on executing a search warrant in 2004 because of political sensitivity. And then came the discovery that changed everything. A forensic team, re-examining the evidence stored from the original case, located a length of rope preserved in a mislabeled box, something retrieved from near the quarry years earlier, and inexplicably logged as miscellaneous debris. New testing methods revealed traces of blood embedded in the fibers. The DNA was Lily's, and mixed with hers was a faint but conclusive profile belonging to a male relative of the Hamptons. The science was undeniable, and the town's last defense, its willful ignorance, finally crumbled. Travis was brought in for questioning. The interview lasted nearly 6 hours. According to the official transcript later leaked to the press, he began calm, detached, claiming again that he'd dropped her off near her home. But as detectives presented the DNA results, his tone shifted. He became defensive, agitated, his voice cracking with anger. "You don't understand," he said at one point. "It was an accident. She wouldn't stop yelling. She wouldn't listen." There it was, the first real confession the town had ever heard, though even then he tried to twist it into something sympathetic, as if the years of lies could be softened by remorse. When pressed about why he hadn't called for help, he slammed his fist on the table. "You think anyone would have believed me? My father said to let it go, that it would ruin us all." And then, after a long silence, he muttered, "He was right about that, too." The arrest came quietly, almost politely, as though the town couldn't bear to make noise about its own guilt. Travis was let out of his house in handcuffs just before dawn. Rain had returned, drumming softly on the hood of the patrol car. A handful of neighbors watched from their porches, expressionless, as the car disappeared down the hill. No one cheered. No one cursed. It was as if they were watching not just a man being taken away, but a spell being broken. The news spread quickly, carried by headlines and whispers alike. Reporters flooded the town again, searching for quotes, for outrage, for the kind of emotion that could fit neatly into a broadcast. But Birch Hollow gave them nothing. People avoided eye contact, closed their doors, pretended to be busy. For the first time, their silence didn't protect anyone. It only condemned them. Jake attended the first court hearing, standing at the back as Travis entered in an orange jumpsuit, thinner and grayer than before. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the weight of nearly 2 decades of avoidance. When the charges were read, second-degree murder, evidence tampering, obstruction, there was no sound but the rustle of papers and the faint creak of wooden pews. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Jake lingered on the steps watching the sunset bleed across the hills. The case had finally reached the point where truth was undeniable, but the cost of reaching it was written on every face he saw. Birch Hollow wasn't celebrating justice. It was mourning itself. The town had built its survival on silence, and now that silence had turned to dust. Yet as Jake looked down the long stretch of road that wound toward the quarry, he felt something like clarity. Not peace, not closure, but the understanding that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, stays still forever. Somewhere, the rain was beginning again, steady and familiar, washing over the same earth that had hidden Lily Marlowe for 18 years. And this time, it sounded less like mourning and more like awakening. The trial of Travis Hampton began in early autumn of 2023, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, Birch Hollow found itself under a light so bright that every shadow the town had spent decades nurturing began to dissolve. The courthouse, a squat brick building with ivy climbing its walls, became the reluctant stage for a story everyone already knew, but no one had ever dared to say aloud. Reporters from Charleston, and even a few from national outlets filled the pews, their cameras perched like vultures at the back of the room. The townspeople came too, dressed in their Sunday best. faces taut with that complicated mixture of curiosity, shame, and something like penance. The older generation sat stiff and silent, avoiding each other's eyes, while younger residents, who had grown up hearing the story as a whisper, watched as if witnessing the final act of a tragedy that had shaped their lives before they were even born. Travis entered through a side door, flanked by deputies, his once carefully cultivated composure now worn thin. He looked smaller, diminished by the fluorescent light, his hands trembling slightly as he took his seat beside his attorney. The years had not been kind to him. The arrogance that once carried him through every room in Birch Hollow had hardened into something bitter and defensive. He avoided looking toward the gallery, though when he did, it was always quick, searching, as if expecting to find someone he knew. The prosecutor, a woman named Andrea Bell, wasted no time in setting the tone. In her opening statement, she painted a portrait of a town poisoned by silence, a girl who had trusted the wrong man, and a system that chose wealth over truth. Her voice was steady but edged with quiet fury as she spoke of the missing reports, the delayed warrants, the sheriff's convenient blindness. This case, she said, is not only about one man's crime, but about an entire community's complicity. The soil of Birch Hollow buried more than a body. It buried conscience. Her words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the room. The defense countered with predictably polished indifference, describing the incident as a tragic accident, the act of a young man overwhelmed by emotion and fear. They argued that Travis had panicked, that his father's influence had dictated his silence, that no one should be judged for the sins of his youth after so many years. But even as his lawyer spoke, it was clear the narrative no longer belonged to them. Too much had surfaced. Too many lies had finally been recorded in ink. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically. They presented the DNA evidence from the rope, the forensic reports detailing the match between soil found in Travis's boots and sediment from the quarry, and the testimony of the retired deputy, who finally admitted under oath that he had been ordered to stand down in 2004. Each revelation chipped away at the town's last defense, the idea that no one had really known. The witnesses came one by one, former classmates, townspeople, even employees from the Hampton estate, each of them offering fragments of memory that, when woven together, revealed the truth everyone had sensed but refused to acknowledge. One woman testified that she had seen Travis's truck on the quarry road that night, headlights cutting through the storm. She had wanted to tell someone, she said, but her husband warned her it would destroy their family. Her voice cracked as she said, "I thought keeping quiet would keep us safe. It didn't. It just kept her gone." Jake Turner was called to the stand midway through the trial. His testimony wasn't about the night of the crime, but about the years that followed, the patterns of evasion, the missing evidence, the town's unwillingness to cooperate. He spoke plainly, without theatrics, detailing the investigation he'd reignited, the discovery of the misfiled rope sample, and the conversations he'd had with those who once feared to speak. His words carried the weight of persistence, not vengeance. "The truth didn't disappear," he said. "It just waited for someone to stop being afraid." When he stepped down, there was a silence that felt heavier than applause. Outside the courthouse, the media fed on every update, every photograph, every hint of scandal. For Birch Hollow, the coverage was both punishment and absolution. Old secrets resurfaced in conversations on porches and at church potlucks, where people confessed in half-sentences the things they'd known and chosen to ignore. Some defended their silence as necessity, claiming they had families to protect. Others admitted to cowardice outright. But no one could deny that the town had been complicit in creating the vacuum where Lily's disappearance had festered for nearly 2 decades. Her name, once spoken with avoidance, was now everywhere, on the news, in headlines, carved into the collective guilt of a place that had built its peace on forgetting. The turning point came during the final week of testimony, when a former housekeeper for the Hamptons, an elderly woman named May Ellison, took the stand. She had worked for the family for more than 30 years, retiring shortly after the disappearance. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. She told the court that the morning after the storm, she had found Travis's clothes in the laundry room, soaked and streaked with mud. When she asked about them, his father told her to burn them. "He said the boy had been in an accident," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I saw the blood. I knew it wasn't his." Her statement broke whatever thin barrier of denial remained. Even Travis lowered his head then, as though the words had struck something long dormant inside him. By the time closing arguments began, the trial had become less about guilt and more about reckoning. The prosecutor reminded the jury that every act of silence was a choice, that justice delayed was not justice denied unless people allowed it to be. The defense tried to humanize Travis, portraying him as the product of a corrupt system rather than its architect. But the jury, composed mostly of residents from nearby counties, didn't see a system. They saw a man who had lived freely for 18 years, while the girl he claimed to love lay hidden in the dark. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted not in cheers, but in the deep, trembling quiet of collective release. Some cried. Some simply stared ahead, unable to reconcile what justice felt like after so long. Travis sat motionless, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, as if waiting for a reprieve that never came. The judge, an old man with tired eyes, thanked the jury and pronounced sentence: life imprisonment without parole. It was a verdict that rippled beyond the courthouse, through the streets, into the hearts of everyone who had once chosen not to speak. That evening, as the news spread and the reporters packed up their vans, a slow rain began to fall. The lights of Birch Hollow shimmered through the haze, the town quieter than ever, but somehow lighter, as though an old weight had finally lifted. Jake stood once more at the edge of the quarry, now cordoned off by yellow tape and silent machines, watching the water ripple under the drizzle. He thought about Lily, about the way she had believed in escape, in truth, in something better than this place. For the first time, he let himself imagine that her story might finally be ending, not with silence, but with an echo that refused to fade. And as the wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine across the hollow, he felt it, the fragile, unfamiliar beginning of peace. But peace in Birch Hollow had never lasted long. Somewhere in the distance, behind shuttered windows and locked doors, new whispers were already forming. Questions about who else had helped, what other secrets still lay buried in the hills. Because in a town built on silence, the truth was never a single story. It was a fire, and now that it had been lit, there was no telling what else it might burn. When the sentence was finally handed down, and Travis Hampton was led from the courthouse in shackles, it should have felt like the end of something. The cameras lingered on his bowed head. The flashbulbs caught the rain that streaked across his face, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the balance had been restored, that Birch Hollow could at last exhale after nearly 20 years of holding its breath. But as weeks turned into months, what settled over the valley was not peace, but a strange, echoing quiet. The trial had ended, the headlines had moved on, but the story had left scars on the town that could not be unseen. For the first time, people had been forced to look directly at what they had done. Not only the Hamptons and their allies, but every neighbor, every preacher, every store clerk who had chosen the comfort of silence over the discomfort of truth. The Hamptons estate was sold within a month of the verdict, its contents auctioned off in a spectacle that felt less like justice and more like penance. Locals came to bid on furniture, paintings, and heirlooms, not out of greed, but from a morbid need to see the empire dismantled piece by piece. The mansion itself, once a symbol of power that loomed over Birch Hollow like a threat, stood hollow and stripped by winter's end, its windows dark, the driveway overgrown with weeds. Some said they heard sounds from the empty house at night, the echo of footsteps, the slam of a door, a voice whispering through the rafters. But superstition had always been Birch Hollow's language, a way to explain the things it couldn't bear to name. The truth was simpler. The town was haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. Jake Turner remained in Birch Hollow for several months after the trial, staying at the same roadside motel where he had first returned the year before. He had been offered work by the state as a consultant on unresolved cases, but he hesitated, unsure whether he wanted to keep digging through the rot of forgotten lives. The Marlowe case had consumed him for too long, and though it had ended in conviction, it hadn't brought the satisfaction he'd imagined. He often drove the back roads at dusk, watching the fog rise over the river, feeling the landscape press in around him like something alive. Birch Hollow, for all its ugliness, still held a kind of sad beauty. The soft roll of the hills, the smell of rain-soaked pine, the sound of crickets vibrating through the dark. It was the same beauty that had trapped so many people there, convincing them that staying silent was safer than disrupting the peace. He spent long evenings talking with the few residents who would still meet his eyes. Some wanted to unburden themselves, confessing the small betrayals that had accumulated into something monstrous. A retired schoolteacher told him she'd known about Travis and Lily's fights, that she had once called the sheriff only to be told to mind her business. The bartender from the Silver Spur admitted that on the night of the disappearance, he'd handed Travis his car keys, even though the boy could barely stand. Each story added another layer to the same realization. No one had acted alone, and no one had acted enough. Jake listened, recorded, and filed the statements, but he knew that the justice system had already taken its due. What remained was something the courts couldn't touch, the slow process of reckoning that would either heal the town or hollow it out completely. Meanwhile, new rumors began to stir. There were whispers that Travis's father hadn't merely helped cover up the crime, but had been involved in other dealings long buried: bribery, blackmail, the quiet silencing of more than one inconvenient voice. Old financial records hinted at payments to local officials around the time of Lily's disappearance. The state police opened an inquiry, but those who might have testified were either dead or unwilling to relive the humiliation of another trial. Birch Hollow had spent nearly 2 decades under the weight of one secret. It wasn't ready to exhume another. Yet the whispers spread anyway, a slow contagion of guilt that moved through every remaining household. Joan Marlowe's house, long abandoned since her death, became a kind of shrine. Strangers left flowers at the gate, candles flickering on the porch steps where she had once waited for her daughter to come home. Her name appeared in national articles about perseverance and moral courage, though no one writing those stories could truly understand the quiet endurance of her grief. Jake visited the house one evening before leaving town. The air inside smelled of dust and pine cleaner, the furniture still draped in sheets, the walls lined with photographs of Lily at different ages, smiling, laughing, forever young. He stood in the living room for a long time, the weight of everything pressing down on him, and realized that justice could never equal restoration. You can punish a man for what he's done, he thought, but you can't undo the years that fear stole from everyone else. The following winter brought floods to the valley. The river rose, swallowing fields and back roads, and for a while the town was cut off from the rest of the county. Some said it was retribution, nature reclaiming what had been denied. Others saw it as cleansing. When the waters receded, the quarry filled higher than ever, its surface smooth and opaque like black glass. The state placed a fence around it and posted warning signs, but people still came. They said the air there felt different now, lighter, as if the land itself had been released from its long silence. Still, no one lingered too long. The past had a way of echoing in that hollow, in the sound of water lapping against the rocks, in the memory of headlights on a rain-slick road. Travis Hampton began serving his life sentence at Mount Olive Correctional Complex. Reports about him were sparse, but an article published 6 months after the trial described him as withdrawn, avoiding contact with other inmates, spending most of his days in the prison library. He had filed an appeal, claiming misconduct during the investigation, but few believed it would succeed. To the people of Birch Hollow, he had become both a symbol and a scapegoat, the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong and the convenient vessel for their guilt. They could point to him and say the debt had been paid, even as they continued to live with the residue of their own complicity. By the time spring returned, Jake knew it was time to leave. He packed his files into boxes, mailed copies of his reports to the state, and took one last drive through town. He passed the church, the boarded-up diner, the rusting sign at the edge of the quarry road. Everywhere he looked, the traces of Lily's story lingered: faded posters on telephone poles, wilted flowers by the roadside, graffiti scrawled by teenagers who had turned her name into legend. Birch Hollow would survive, because that was what towns did, but it would never be innocent again. On his final night, he stopped by the overlook above the valley. The sky was heavy with stars, the kind of clear darkness that made the mountains seem infinite. He thought about the people who would stay behind, about the ones who would continue to whisper her name in guilt or reverence. He thought about the years lost, the lives altered, the lies that had stretched so far they had become indistinguishable from truth. Then he thought of Lily herself, the girl who had wanted to leave, who had believed there was something better waiting beyond the mountains. In a way, she had finally escaped. Her story had broken through the silence that had held an entire town captive. The cost was immeasurable, but her name would not fade again. As Jake turned to go, the wind rose through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Somewhere down in the valley, a door slammed, echoing like a gunshot. He paused, listening, but the sound did not come again. For a long moment he stood there, the night pressing close around him, and understood that Birch Hollow would never truly be free of its ghosts. The difference now was that the ghosts had names, and they would not be forgotten. And in that uneasy acknowledgement, between truth and peace, between guilt and grace, the hollow finally began to breathe again. Spring came late to Birch Hollow in 2025, the kind of slow, uncertain spring that crept over the mountains as if testing whether it was safe to return. The rain softened, the trees bloomed reluctantly, and the town, though older and quieter, seemed to move with a new rhythm. The trial, the headlines, the investigators, all had left, taking with them the chaos that had briefly disturbed the stillness. What remained was the long work of living with the truth. People spoke of Lily Marlowe now without lowering their voices, her name woven into conversations like a prayer. At the church, a plaque had been placed near the altar in her memory, the inscription simple: "She was seen. She was heard. She is home." On warm evenings, someone always left a single white lily on the steps, and though no one ever said who it was, everyone understood. The town that once prided itself on silence had learned to speak again, not loudly, not perfectly, but enough. The old quarry was finally filled that summer, the state covering it with layers of soil and planting wildflowers where the water once pooled. It was not an act of erasure, but of transformation. People came to see it during the dedication, standing in the gentle wind as the mayor read a short statement about renewal. Children ran through the tall grass, their laughter rising where there had once been only echoes. Jake Turner returned briefly for the ceremony, standing apart from the crowd, hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon. He had spent the last year consulting for the state, helping uncover other forgotten cases, but this one would always belong to him, not because it had brought him glory, but because it had forced him to understand what justice truly meant. He thought about Joan Marlowe, about the years she had fought alone, and wished she could have seen this day. Justice had not come when she was alive, but perhaps peace had come in her name. The Hamptons were gone, their names stripped from the church plaques, their business dissolved, their wealth scattered in lawsuits and debts. Travis's appeal was denied, and from prison he sent no letters, gave no interviews, and accepted no visitors. His absence became its own kind of punishment for Birch Hollow. Without the family that had once controlled its fate, the town had to find its own sense of direction. The new sheriff, a young woman from Morgantown, reopened several dormant files from the same decade, insisting that the lesson of the Marlowe case was not vengeance, but vigilance. "A secret is not protection," she told a local reporter. "It's a slow kind of death." Her words, printed in the county paper, were pinned to the bulletin board at the post office, as if the town needed to see them daily to remember. In late summer, Jake visited Lily's grave, a simple stone at the edge of the cemetery, shaded by a weeping willow. The ground around it was covered in wild violets, their scent light in the humid air. He stayed there for a long while, speaking softly to the quiet earth, telling her that her story had changed more than anyone could ever measure. The mountains seemed gentler that day, their outlines softened by mist, and for the first time since he had returned to Birch Hollow, he felt something close to release. When he finally stood to leave, he looked down at the town spread below him, the rooftops, the river, the slow, curling roads, and thought about how stories, like people, leave shadows that never really disappear. But shadows, he realized, were proof of light. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, the town bells rang for the first time in years. The sound drifted through the hollow, low and steady, carrying with it a sense of closure that felt neither final nor fragile. Birch Hollow would never be innocent again, but innocence was never the point. It was the courage to face what had been hidden, to speak what had been unspeakable, that now defined it. And as the light faded and the mountains turned gold, it seemed, for a fleeting moment, that the valley itself exhaled, softly, completely, like a place that had finally learned to live with its ghosts and let them rest.